When you laugh, you'll feel my breath there filling up your lungs. And when you cry, those aren't your tears, but I'm there falling down your cheek. And when you say you love him, taste me, I'm like poison on your tongue. But when you're tired, if you're quiet, you'll hear me singing you to sleep. Welcome back, my friends, to the Dime Store Cinema, where we talk movies and culture. And tonight, a little bit about a book. I'm joined today with Basil Hayden Smallpatch. I picked this up as due to a suggestion. I was told it is a very good beginner's bourbon, and I definitely agree with that assessment. The flavor profile is definitely not as complex as what I typically drink, which is great for late night or after dinner bourbon consumption. And since I'm recording later than normal tonight, it's doing quite well. The lyrics I read at the opening is from the song Bullet to Binary. It's a song from the first full-length album, released by one of my favorite bands, Me Without You. And the reason I chose to read that verse is the music video is based on the book that got me thinking recently about the current state of things. And the book is The Giving Tree by Shel Silverstein. I grew up on this book. My parents used to read it to me quite frequently. It was one of my favorites as a small child, particularly before I could read and before I started having them read me chapter books. I always liked it because I saw it as being twofold almost, whereas you could enjoy the book through the boy's perspective or through the tree's perspective, and you can learn different things from either perspective. You can learn to use those things that are around you to make it through the world from the boy's perspective, and you can learn to be a selfless representation of sort of a Christ figure through the tree's perspective. As I've grown up, I've kind of started to interpret the book through the lens of the tree and kind of seen the tree as a parental figure. As a parent, you never stop giving to your children with literally no expectation of them giving back until at the end, all they have left is the foundation that you built for them to rest on and essentially view and mull over all that you had given them. So that's kind of how I started seeing that book as I got a little older. Now, there are obviously different interpretations. You could see it almost as a Christ to the church type story, which I don't think was Mr. Silverstein's point, but you could definitely see that in there if you wanted to. Given who Shel Silverstein was, I think it had probably a little bit more to do with just being a fun story. But on top of that, I think there's more of an environmental lean to it, at least as far as what he was going for, kind of making a comment on how people tend to take advantage of nature for their own benefit until either they reach a level of maturity where all they want to do is sit and contemplate, or they essentially take all of the resources until all that's left is for them to sit and ruminate on what they've squandered. A bit heavy for a children's book, but Mr. Silverstein, although his drawings and his stories were very cute and fun and a little offbeat, which is why I always liked them, I think he did kind of fit in those kind of commentaries where he could, just based on what little I know of kind of what he was going for. But I always enjoyed his book as a kid. But like I said, you can interpret it many different ways. But really what got me thinking about it, and got me thinking a lot about the current state of things, is my wife and daughter and I were in Barnes & Noble, and we were talking about books, and I saw The Giving Tree, and I pointed it out. And she had mentioned that she had seen somewhere that people were interpreting it as being pro-communist, which made me probably a little more angry than it should have, given that, as I just said, there are multiple interpretations you can have of it. And it really got me thinking about a lot of things. And it might just be the circles that I travel in. It might have me in somewhat of an echo chamber, in thinking that maybe things are persisting in a way that are not necessarily accurate to the general public. But what I've been noticing lately is just this bleeding in of politics into every aspect of our lives. And I noticed this even at my previous job, where conversations that would come up would tend to lean towards some type of political bent, even to where when colleagues were talking about people that they got along with, one of the things they felt compelled to mention is that they shared a common politic with the person that they were getting to know, as if that's something that suggests that the friendship will be more successful. I understand that in maybe like a marriage, where it's a good idea to have some kind of common ground with that, because it can relate to different ways of raising children and other things like that. But even then, I'm not so sure. But it got me thinking about how we're forcing a political interpretation of things that are meant to be personal or social meaning. That is to say, very wise men often say, and have said, that politics is downstream from culture. Personally, I think that it's more cyclical than that. That is to say that they kind of create their own feedback loop. Culture influences politics, but politics influence culture, and they go back and forth, and they feed into one another. They bolster one another until an extreme is reached where there's blowback and causes a different cycle to begin. I tend to think of it more of a pendulum, more so than a river. Rivers lead into the ocean. So I see it more as a pendulum swinging back and forth while maintaining a forward momentum. And I think a lot of times what forces that pendulum to swing is when people start forcing a political worldview onto aspects of life that aren't really best suited for being political. What do I mean by that? Well, Personally, I think that there are, and I hate this word because I think that it's misused and overused a lot. Hierarchy. I think there are different, we'll put it this way, priorities in our lives. And they tend to, with humans, they tend to be proximal. That is, that they have to do with the proximity to you. So your biggest priority, at least should be in a healthy sense, is you and your family. And then from there, your immediate community, the people you associate with voluntarily. And then from there, your regional community, where you live. And then from there, your extended county, essentially. And then from there, your state, and so on and so forth. I don't like, and I think that it's very foolish, and I think that it's horrifying that we're starting to try to incorporate particularly federal politics into the personal realm. So when I see the giving tree, I see the tree being a symbol of parenthood. I see the tree being a metaphor of what a parent does. So that is a personal, something that is very proximal to you, to me as an individual. It's an individual governance. It has nothing to do with a federal governance. We can't rule ourselves if we relinquish the responsibility of governing ourselves to something outside of ourselves. I think this is even true in a religious sense, whereas the expectation from God in a religious sense is for you to govern yourself in a way that is pleasing to that deity. And any time that there is forced action, that is not an action that can be considered virtuous. Virtue comes from the choice to make the action. So the most virtuous actions are not those actions that are compelled, but instead are those actions that are freely chosen. So when you try to give a governing body the permission to govern your personal life, you relinquish any possibility that you then have to generate and benefit your virtue. So one of my issues is that multiple things can be true at once. We don't have to live in a monolithic framework, or even a bimodal. Multiple things can be true. For instance, I mentioned communism previously as it relates to the giving tree. I think that communism is a perfectly viable form of people living their lives, even if it's a completely disastrous form of governance. When people share the same belief, they can persist in small communities where they share everything. the moment that there is a dissenting opinion, if it's a lifestyle that is chosen, the dissenting opinion can leave and participate in a different set of values. If it is a governance, you cannot dissent. It requires full cooperation. And if you don't have full cooperation, well, governments do what they do, which is force. If you dissent from their rules, they send people with guns to make you comply. So, on a small scale, you have personal governance. From there, you go into your community. You associate with the people that you want to associate with, typically because of similar values. You see this in churches, you see this in local communities, you see this in all kinds of different ways that people associate with those people who have similar views. And then from there, you extrapolate out. And the more you extrapolate out, the more unfocused it has to be. So I hear people talking about their personal lives and their family, their friends. They're trying to incorporate, for the most part, federal governance in parts of their lives that have no business to incorporate it. The federal government is too detached from you personally, from your community, from your county, in your state, to make any kind of reasonable decision. If you want to talk to your local government about that, and if you want that to be a major part in your life, then I get it. But the federal government is too incompetent, not necessarily because of the people, although I will say because of the people, but because of their detachment. They're not near you. They're not in the same realm. These people are not in the same social strata. They're not within the same community. They spend all of their time in Washington or campaigning. They don't know you. They don't care about you. They don't have to care about you. And I say this, I've mentioned many times that I don't like getting political, but I say this from a sense of frustration, from a sense of bewilderment, just wanting people to be able to communicate with one another. I frequently say that my area of, I don't know if I'd say expertise, but my area of study is stories. And the best way to discover and participate in your own story is to be able to talk to people. And if we're, as a community, so obsessed with a body that is so detached from us, then we're burning bridges of communication. We often talk about how people see themselves as being the hero of their own story. And there are varying ways to interpret that. Some people are very critical of that, saying that no, you're nothing, you're meaningless. But I think in a very real sense, all of us are the hero of our own story, because we're all participating in a story. And if you see yourself that way, then your immediate choices, each one of them, progress that story. So if you think of yourself, or if you start thinking of yourself as the hero of your own story, right? You want to go on a hero's journey. What are those first steps? Are the first steps looking at the broad, big picture that no one can even come close to being able to understand because of the detachment? Or is it understanding that which is immediate and taking the first step? And each step is a first step, because each step is stepping out into the unknown. Every step we take is an unknown step into an unknown journey, into an unknown future, into an unknown territory. And it's so much more beneficial to us as individuals to be focused on what's immediately around us. And yes, you can have thoughts and you can participate in those bigger picture issues, but for your personal life, and since the Giving Tree was so personal to me, it's what got me thinking about this. In your personal life, it's so much wiser to be grounded in your immediate community. That's your sphere of influence. If you see yourself as participating in a hero's journey, your sphere of influence is your immediate surroundings, and that might expand, that might recede. But either way, focusing on those things that are around you and keeping it to a self-actualized framework. That is, if you truly know yourself, you know your capabilities, you know your sphere of influence, you know what you're capable of, then allow that to guide your steps. I worry that the overemphasis on global problems, global governance, all it leads to is despair, because it's not possible to manage. You know, we try with various methods, and we have governing bodies for this very reason. But even those governing bodies, they can't be simultaneously focused on the minute issues and the larger issues. They have to only be focused on the larger issues, which is why but most of the time when a solution is reached, it's so much more of a cudgel It's just a blanket solution without any attempt at reaching nuance. Nuance, another one of those words that's so frequently misused and frustratingly overused, I should say. But humans are very complex creatures because we're not either or creatures. We're both and creatures. That is, we have the capability of being contradictions within ourselves without it being a detriment to us. We're perfectly capable of maintaining a seeming contradiction that is lived out in a way that is not contradicting with itself. We have firm beliefs and morals, but with caveats. We have sworn enemies that we would still not allow certain things to happen to. There's so many things about humans that are complicated. And to think that any kind of rule from the top down would be as effective as a multitude of small communities coming together to essentially test things out. It's one of the things that I respect so much about the American system, or at least the way it was supposed to be. Not making any claim one way or the other of its place in the ranking of countries, but since the American system allows states so much power, each state can be an experiment. And that localized small experiment can provide data for the rest of the country at large. And I think this is a perfect representation in a macro scale of a micro principle that we have. You know, we as individuals do things to test things out, and that informs our immediate family as well as our community. And so it's this larger representation of things that work really well in what we can observe in our everyday life. And I think that's why it is, in a sense, successful, or has been, and why it angers me and somewhat frightens me that we have gradually been moving away from that model and instead wanting a centralized, larger government. It's removing the country's ability to have those small-scale petri dishes, we'll say, which means that if we don't have the small-scale tests and instead we're doing only large-scale tests, when one of those tests fails, it'll have a much larger impact. It'll be more difficult to manage if it's just a county or a state. That's one thing. and that's terrible, and that's going to affect a lot of people. But if it's an entire country, well, that's a much larger issue for us to deal with. And I apologize. This is, as I said at the beginning, a stream of consciousness musing of sorts, to steal a phrase, once again, from Father Thomas Hopko. But all of this stemmed from the giving tree. It's a seeming non sequitur, I know, and I apologize. But there are reasons why conservatives, for instance, are afraid of change. And it has to do with some of the things that I've said. And I've never really considered myself a full-on conservative because I'm not opposed to change. But I will say that that stems because change is necessary. Technology, for just a small example, requires it. But that comes with a caveat, because if change happens too quickly, then everything falls apart. People starve, people die, people take up arms and fight. If the wrong change is made, people starve, people die, people take up arms and fight. If the changes that happen benefit some people and harm other people, people starve, people die, people take up arms and fight. So, change for change's sake is not good. We need to be able to communicate and talk and allow the best argument with the best evidence win. And the best way to do that is to allow as many of those conversations as possible. And the best way to do that is to maintain these smaller spheres of influence. I mean, you think of it in terms of an atom made up of multiple parts, right? To comprise one thing, you have multiple parts working together. They work as their own entity. However, they also work with a group of those same types of entity structures. They all work together to essentially make up everything within this world. And we can extrapolate. This is something that philosophers and thinkers have been doing throughout all of time. You have Lao Tzu just observing nature and coming up with these brilliant philosophical principles by just watching nature. And same with some of the early scientists or predating pre-scientists, observing nature to understand concepts that humans should live by based on the autonomous universe that we live in. Now, there are some things that we can overcome, and we work really hard to overcome those things, but as a general principle, we can learn basic ideas from nature itself. And bring me back to the atom. The best way for us to form the best ideas is for a multitude of small spheres of influences communicating so that ideas can be tested and argued and tested and argued until they're refined into something that cannot be destroyed. And then that sphere of influence will grow. And then more strengthening of the idea. It grows and grows and grows and grows and grows and grows and grows until it encompasses everything in existence. We can't have that if everything is centralized, if everything is top down. We can only have that if we break it down into multiple small spheres of influence that then comprise everything, just like atoms, just like communities, just like people. We're comprised of many parts of the body, and it's the functioning of all of them together that makes the body function. And even the brain, which many would agree is the most important organ of the body, is still comprised of multiple smaller things. Everything can be broken down. And that's the thing with any kind of critical theory. I agree that they're wonderful thought exercises. Thought exercises working on deconstructing everything down to its very base level so that you can test an idea is great. It's a great mode of thought. The problem is, if that's your only mode of thought, then you can't build anything. If that's your only mode of thought, then you can't confer with other people. If that's your only mode of thought, then you can't determine what good ideas are. Because if you work hard enough, you can even deconstruct a good idea. So, yes, it's a great thought experiment to deconstruct. But no, that's not how we can get better at anything. And that goes back to what I was saying earlier, with people can be complicated. The act of deconstruction can be beneficial if it's paired with also construction. Seeming opposite points of view married together to make something better, to make something beautiful, to construct something from either nothing or from something that existed prior. You know, you can apply that even to the giving tree. You know, you deconstruct the tree, but in deconstructing the tree, you have used those parts that you've deconstructed to construct something else to make your life better from the perspective of the boy, right? So you can deconstruct as long as the deconstruction is then aimed at constructing something. You can't have one without the other. You also can't jump into trying to construct something if you don't know the sum of its parts. You have to know the sum of its parts in order to construct it. You can't just look at a house and know how to build it. You have to know its individual parts. So, just speaking towards the complexity of human existence. You know, the hierarchy of government within a home cannot be and should not be the same hierarchy of governance that's in your community or your county or your state or your country. They're all different problems. They're all different levels of understanding, and each subsequent step up becomes further removed and less focused. So, speaking to the complexity of the human mind, each one of those spheres can speak to a different part of yourself. You can have firm convictions about each one of those spheres, and they may completely contradict one another. And they can live all within the same mind. And in I would say most cases that's a good thing, because you can't have the same mode of governance over every one of those things. If you do, you end up with people dying, people starving, people taking up arms and fighting. So let's do what we can to avoid that. Let's stop trying to hand over our virtue to the government. Let's stop trying to hand over more and more of our spheres to the federal government. And let's start realizing that we are all complex beings who can exist in seemingly contradictory states all at once. And the only way that we can work through that is to allow ourselves to discuss it, to allow ourselves to deconstruct for the purpose of construction. And not one or the other, but both. It always has to be both. Until next time, my friends, this has been Justin C. Bartlett with the Dime Store Cinema, reminding you all to fill your lives with amazing stories.